Do you need to understand net present value, perhaps for a finance class at school or maybe a project you're evaluating at work? If so, you're in the right place. Hi, I'm Brian with Value Driven Analytics, and today I'm wearing my black Value Driven Analytics shirt because after calculating net present value, we always want to be in the black and not the red. Now, NPV can be a little daunting at first with its formulas, but I'm here to tell you that NPV is really a gift. That's why they call it net present value. Should we take that out? I think we should take that out. Let's get started. Before we go over a few net present value use cases in Excel, let's talk about why it's important in the first place. It comes down to the time value of money, which means a dollar today is generally worth more than a dollar in the future. There are several reasons for this. People generally prefer to have and enjoy money now rather than later. We don't know if we'll be around to enjoy cash flows in the future. There's also expected inflation in the future, which means we expect the dollar won't be able to buy as much in the future as it can today. Put another way, and this is probably a reflection of all three of those reasons, if you had the money now, you could invest it and get in the future the money you invested plus a certain amount of interest. When it comes to actually calculating the net present value of something, like an investment, the discount rate that you use is absolutely critical. As we'll see in Excel, the higher the discount rate you use, the more future cash flows will be discounted when you calculate their current value. So the discount rate being used can have a big impact on whether the investment is considered to be a good one or not. Let's talk about some of the factors that can influence the discount rate. And one is inflation. The higher the expected future inflation, the higher the discount rate will generally be. Especially if a company or person would be borrowing money to make the investment, the rate at which they can borrow based on their perceived risk to a bank will heavily determine what their discount rate is. The perceived risk level of the investment from the company or individual's perspective could also add to that discount rate. If the payoff of the investment seems relatively certain, the discount rate would be lower than if there's a lot of uncertainty around future expected cash flows. And if a company or person were using their own money to make a certain investment, their discount rate would be heavily influenced by the rate of return they could get on other investments of a similar risk level. The discount rate essentially represents the opportunity cost of money at a certain risk level. Now that we've talked about the time value of money and the discount rate, let's jump into Excel and see some real examples of net present value. Welcome to our net present value example workbook. And we're going to start off with a simple lump sum scenario. We're going to look at the alternative of getting $11,000 in a lump sum amount all at once 10 years from now and see at what point, what amount would we need to receive today to be willing to give up an $11,000 lump sum payment 10 years from now. Now the discount rate we're using in this example is 5%. Maybe that's the rate of interest we could receive if we had the money today. And then we'll be using a lump sum amount of about $11,000, again, 10 years from now. So we have a chart here that shows us year by year what the expected cash flow amount is. And right now it's $0 until year 10, we get a lump sum amount 10 years from now of $11,000. So our future value 10 years from now of $11,000 is $11,000. But what would the net present value be? Well, the net present value formula is relatively simple, and you can see that if we double click on this cell M23, what we're doing is taking that future cash flow, or any cash flow, $11,000, and we are dividing it by a formula, and that is 1, or think about that as 100%, 1 plus the discount rate, in this case 5%, think about that as 0.05. So 1 plus the discount rate, in this case, would be 1.05. If our discount rate was 10%, that would be 1.1. 1 plus the discount rate. But before we do our division, we take that 1 plus the discount rate, in this case 1.05, and we raise that to the number of periods. In this case, our interest rate is annually, and our number of periods are annual periods, numbers of years. And so we raise that 1.05 in this case to the number of periods, which is the number of years, 10. And so 1.05 to the 10th power is what we're ultimately going to take. We're going to divide that into our cash flow. And so if we just do that step by step, I'll just do it in the cell below here. 1 plus, in this case our discount rate is 0.05, gives us 1.05. Now when we take that and we raise it to the 10th power, we're essentially doing 1.05 times 1.05 times 1.05. We're doing that 10 times, or 9 times. We start with 1.05 and then multiply it by 1.05 9 more times, so a total of 10 1.05s in this example. That gets us to about 1.63 or so. And that is the factor that we're going to divide into whatever that cash flow is for that time period. So in this case, the cash flow amount would be $11,000 in year 10. So we take that 11,000 and we divide by that 1.63 factor, and that gets us to a net present value. That $11,000 is worth $6,753 in today's money. Remember, today's money is worth more than future money. And future money, that $11,000, is worth less than today's money. Well, why is that? Let's look at the alternative. What if you had that $6,753 today? How does that become worth $11,000 10 years from now? Well, if you had that exact amount we calculated, the $6,753, and you invested that today, put it in the bank, you would earn at 5% interest. We're using that as our discount rate. I basically have a formula here that's going to take that amount of money that occurs at the beginning of that time period. I'm going to multiply it by our discount rate, 0.05, and you earn that much interest, which means in the following period, your bank account balance would be your previous bank account balance plus that amount of interest, which in the beginning of year 2 here would be $7,091. Then that is a higher amount, so it gets slightly higher interest of $355 in year 2 than it did in year 1, $338. This is compounding interest happening here right before our eyes, and we'll see that that amount continues to increase all the way through year 10 until at the end of year 10, when you add in the $524 you get in interest on the balance that we started with in year 10, $10,476, you end up with exactly $11,000, the very amount that we were talking about getting 10 years from now. And that is why $11,000 in the future is worth $6,753 today with a discount rate of 5%. It's because we could take that money today, that $6,700, and invest it at 5%, and have $11,000 in the future. Either way, we're happy. If you were to say we could have $8,000 today, we would take that because we'd be able to have even more than $11,000 in the future. Let's move on to an annuity scenario. So before, we got all of the money in year 10 in one time, one lump sum amount. With an annuity, it's paid out on an annual basis. And in this case, we'll use $1,000 for our payout. You can see in year 1, and even starting today, you get $1,000. And in year 1, you get $1,000. In year 2, you get $1,000. You get the idea. You add all this up over the course of 10 years, including a payout of $1,000 today, and it all adds up to the same $11,000 that we were looking at before. But in this case, it's paid out as an annuity. What we're going to do is, in order to calculate the net present value of this entire annuity, we need to discount each one of these cash flows, and it's going to be different. The net present value of the $1,000 today, well, net present value basically means we're taking that money and bringing it into today's dollars. So if it's happening today, it is the same amount. Well, year 1, you can see what happens. We're using the exact same formula we used up here in our lump sum example. So what you'll notice here is we're taking the $1,000, we're dividing it by 1 plus our discount rate, which is 0.05 in this example, and it's raised to the power of 1. So we're taking $1,000 and we're dividing by 1.05 in that case. 1.05 to the power of 1 year is 1.05. And so that means that our $1,000 1 year from now would be worth $952 in today's money. It has a net present value of $952. $1,000 2 years from now, though, has a slightly smaller amount worth in today's dollars, a slightly lower net present value. It's the same formula. The only thing that changed here was that we're taking that 1.05 and we're raising it to 2, which makes it a higher number. And since we're dividing a higher number into 1,000, it leads to a net present value that's smaller, $907. And that goes on and on and on until 10 years from now, $1,000 in today's money is only worth $614 because it's so far into the future. So think about that. $1,000 is worth $1,000 today. It's worth $952 1 year from now, but it's worth only $614 if that $1,000 comes 10 years from now. And all of that is based on a discount rate of 5%, which is critical. When we talk about net present value, we need to talk about what the discount rate we're assuming is. Well, in order to really calculate the net present value of this annuity, we need to simply add up all of these discounted cash flows. We're essentially putting everything on the same scale in row 40 here. We're bringing it all in today's money. You see in the first row here, the row that represents the amount of the cash flow in a particular year, it's all based on a different time period. And remember, the time period impacts a amount of money's value in today's dollars. And so we can't add everything up and say that's the value. That we can say the raw payout is $11,000, but it all occurs at different points in time. Well, this row puts everything in today's dollars, so we can simply add this up, and you can see here the total is $8,722, which means that an annuity that pays $1,000 between every year between today and 10 years from now, that $11,000 that gets paid out is actually worth, in today's money, its net present value is $8,722. Well, let's think about why that's the case. Another way of thinking about this, similar to our lump sum example, is what if we had that $8,722 now? This is a little bit of a different example because we're thinking about paying ourselves year by year. So we start with that $8,722, and right away we pay ourselves $1,000 because there's a $1,000 payout in this example. The annuity actually starts with a $1,000 payout. Well, that gives us, at the beginning of year one, $7,722 to invest. If we look at what the interest on that amount would be, and just multiply that by 0.05, that would be an interest we would still receive of $386. Now, remember, we have an annuity here, so we would pay ourselves $1,000. So our balance at the beginning of year two would essentially be the $7,722 plus the interest we received on that, $386, but minus $1,000. So our balance goes down a little bit, not by the full $1,000 because of the interest that we earned. So the next period, the interest is slightly less because our balance was slightly less, but still some interest. We pay ourselves $1,000, and this goes on and on and on. We are getting our $1,000 per month, just like we were before, and by the very end of year 10, we've paid ourselves $1,000 each year, just like we would have if we would have accepted the annuity, and we're left with nothing. Now, we really have the $11,000 that we were paid each year, but we have nothing left over outside of that $1,000 that we paid ourselves. So when you offer me the option of having $1,000 each year for 10 years in a row, or just getting $8,722, I can essentially take that $8,722, especially if I can get a guaranteed interest rate of 5%, the discount rate we're using, and I can invest it, and I can pay myself $1,000 each year and get the same thing. So if you were to offer me $9,000 today, I would probably take that and just invest it. And if I wanted to take out $1,000 to spend it each year, I could. Now here's a good question to ponder. Why was the lump sum $11,000 10 years from now worth $6,753. When the same amount, $11,000 spread over 10 years with $1,000 a year, the annuity example was worth $8,722. Why was the annuity worth more in today's dollars than the lump sum? Well, it comes down to this. In the annuity example, you on average get the money sooner than you do in the lump sum example. In the lump sum example, all of it comes 10 years from now, and we know that the longer you have to wait for money, the less it's worth. That's the time value of money. Well, some of the annuity money you get today, some you get 1 year from now, 2 years from now. There's only $1,000 that you get 10 years from now. The rest of it you get sooner than that. And so when you get money sooner, the money and net present value is worth more. The most extreme example of this would be getting $11,000 today, which is worth $11,000. Before we move on to one more example, I want to show you what happens when we actually change the discount rate. I'm going to scroll up, and all of this is linked to this discount rate, this cell C13. We always recommend linking to different cells and setting parameters at the top of your Excel workbook, or even your code for that matter, if you're a coder. But we're going to change this cell to 10%, and everything else is linked to this cell C13. Let's see what happens to our net present value. Well, when we look at the net present value of our lump sum, that $11,000, instead of being worth the $6,700 or so that it was worth before, now it's only worth $4,200 if our discount rate is 10%. We're discounting future cash flows. That 10 year from now $11,000, we're discounting it more by 10% a year instead of 5% a year. And then in the annuity scenario, our net present value goes from being about $8,700 for that $1,000 a year for 10 years in a row. That goes down to $7,145. So whenever we increase our discount rate, our net present value will go down. So it's really important to make sure you calculate the right discount rate. A lot of companies, there will be somebody who will be able to provide you what the discount rate is. So make sure you get in contact with that person. But if you are responsible for setting that discount rate yourself, think about some of those factors we started with at the beginning of this video. Now we're on the second tab of our net present value example Excel worksheet, and we're going to take a look at a real investment that we might consider. So there's actually a cost to consider in this case, and we have some forecasted future cash flows or future savings, and we're going to determine whether this investment is a positive ROI. You know, you can kind of think about future savings just like future cash flow. So if we save $1,000 per year in the future, you can almost think about that as you received an additional $1,000. As long as the time period of the savings or the cash flow is the same, you can almost think about those as synonymous. Well, in our example here, we have a discount rate. We're going to use 5% again, and we have a certain investment that we would make today of $5,000. But that $5,000 is going to get us an annual savings of $1,000 per year. Now we're only assuming that we're going to get that $1,000 savings for the next 10 years. Perhaps it would stop at that point, but a lot of times when you make an investment in something, your sales or that future cash flow is forever changed. So in a sense, you can almost continue to get that amount forever. So in this case, we're assuming that that money would stop after year 10. We're creating an ROI at year 10, so to speak, and it's really an underestimate of the ROI if that $1,000 were to continue. Now there's a few other ways of doing this as well. You can actually calculate the net present value of an annuity in perpetuity. I guess that would be called perpetuity. But another way of doing it is thinking about, well, at the end of the 10 years, what would the investment that I made, maybe I made an investment in machinery, for instance, what would that machinery be worth 10 years from now? And you can almost think about it as a positive cash flow 10 years from now, I'll be able to sell it for this amount. And that can just be an additional cash flow you factor into the analysis. But all that to say, our example here, you pay $5,000 today, you invest in something, and you get savings or future cash flows of $1,000 a year, starting in year one in this case, all the way through year 10. So much like before in our annuity example, we are discounting the cash flows in each time period. Well, the first cash flow is a negative cash flow, the $5,000 we pay for the thing we're investing in, and that is simply negative $5,000. Unfortunately, this negative amount doesn't get discounted at all because it occurs today. And then you get $1,000 in year one, and that gets discounted. We're using the same formula for discounting we did before. So you'll see here we've got the $1,000 divided by 1 plus our 0.05 for a discount rate to the first power. And so that $1,000 is worth $952. And you can see as we go on year by year, that $1,000 gets made worth less and less in terms of net present value. Year 10, that $1,000 that we receive in year 10 is worth $614. Well, now what we can do, this is where the net present value part comes in. Again, we're going to add all of this up. We've got a negative $5,000 to start us off. You can almost think about this at, you could say, hey, year one, you can see down here in Excel, we're at 4,000, just over negative $4,000. We're still in the hole. And you can almost kind of figure out here, I'm just looking at the sum down here as I start to sum these years. You can almost see that you basically break even somewhere around year 5 or year 6. You're able to take that $1,000 and even after considering the time value of money, break even. Now, if you weren't considering the time value of money, you would break even after year 5. But with the time value of money, the fact that some of these future cash flows, really from a net present value perspective, because the money could have been invested, from a net present value perspective, you're paying off maybe closer to year 6. And then after year 10, we can say, well, what would the total amount of money we gain be from a net present value perspective? And the answer is $2,722. So what I would say about this $5,000 investment is that the total expected value of the investment after subtracting the cost would be a positive $2,722. So we should do the investment in this case. You can see what would happen here if you didn't take into account net present value. That would be summing up this first line. We spent $5,000 today, and we get a total of $10,000 in the future for a total payoff, factoring in the subtracting out the $5,000 cost of $5,000. And so here's what happens from a return on investment perspective. The return on investment formula is very simple. It's your total benefit minus your costs, or you could think about that as your net benefit. So in this case, our raw net benefit, not factoring the time value of money, would be $5,000. It's taking that amount and dividing it by your investment, $5,000. So we get a return of 100% of what we invested. And that'd be, in this case, this would be 100% ROI if you didn't factor in the time value of money, if you didn't factor in the fact that, well, there are alternatives. We could have just invested that money and done it, done well and gotten more money than the $5,000. And then here's our net present value ROI. This would be more of the true ROI when we factor in the time value of money, that fact that we could have invested this $5,000 in a regular bank account at 5% maybe. It ends up being 54%, and that's taking the time value of money net benefit, the $2,722, again, dividing by the investment. So I'll call that our net present value ROI. Now, it still could be hard to wrap our head around the fact that, well, I don't get it. I got a net gain of $5,000. I gained $10,000. I spent $5,000. That's a net gain of $5,000. Why is it $5,000 my ROI? Well, another way of thinking about that is imagine you didn't have the money to pay for that $5,000 investment, and so you had to take out a loan. You took out a loan of $5,000, so your bank account balance essentially, or really your loan amount is $5,000, And your discount rate's 5%. Let's say that represents the interest rate. And so you're having to pay 5% of your account balance every year. So in year one, that would simply be the 5% times the $5,000. You have to pay that. So you were able to invest in this. And so you do get those $1,000 cash flows for the next 10 years, but you did it by borrowing this time. All right, so you're paying the interest. Now, year two or year one, your original balance was negative $5,000. That was your loan balance. You paid some interest, which brought it down even more, but you received $1,000 and you maybe used that to pay down your loan. And so the next year, your balance is a little bit lower, a little bit lower. And again, you can see here, you kind of are able to pay off that $5,000 loan a year, around year 6 or so. Your balance actually becomes positive. Now you're actually earning some interest, and you continue to get the $1,000 a year. Well, you keep going with this and continuing the formula until by year 10, you end up having $4,433, and you didn't invest a penny. You borrowed the investment amount, and you were able to use the benefit, the $1,000 a year, to pay off that loan, and so you're left with $4,483. So okay, how does that reconcile with the $2,722? Well, the $4,433 that we've shown here is the amount of money that you would have, additional money that you would have after paying off the loan and everything in year 10. And if we take that back to today's money, that's what this cell does right here. We take that 4,433, we divide it by 1 plus our discount rate, 5%, and raise that to the 10th power to bring it back in today's money. This ends up being the same as what we calculated up here. The net present value of this investment is $2,722. So we kind of did it from a pure discounting perspective up here, and here we just real world scenario. Okay, we're borrowing $5,000. How much do we gain? How much do we have at the end of year 10? What's that amount worth today? And we get to the same $2,722. Pretty neat. Do you want to dive even further into this topic? Well, we're going to show it in a few other ways on top of this. This is the same $5,000 investment. Here we're looking at the alternative. Remember, we said the discount rate can be thought of as the opportunity cost of money at an associated risk level. Well, what if we took that $5,000 and we invested it in a bank account that pays 5%? Well, let's see what would happen in that scenario. Our bank account balance would start at $5,000. We get, this is just the 5,000 times the 0.05, we get $250 in interest that first year. That interest is going to grow each year as our balance grows. We're compounding on the interest until finally by year 10, you end up with a bank balance of $8,144. That's why the $5,000 today cannot simply be compared with $5,000 in the future. It's worth more today because it has the potential to grow to $8,144 by year 10, for instance. And we need to factor that in to our ROI analysis. Well, now what we're going to do to try to get a fair comparison is we're going to see, hey, what if we'd taken that $5,000 now and invested in this investment? What would that have looked like from a year 10 perspective? We know that if we invest it, we'll get $8,144, and that is in year 10 money. It's not the net present value, that's the year 10 value. Now let's compare that to actually investing in the investment. In both of these scenarios, we take $5,000 and we do something with it. In the first scenario, we put it in a bank. In the second scenario, we invested in whatever we're investing in. And then we get the $1,000 a year. Now in this scenario, we can take that $1,000 we're getting each year and we can invest it. And you can see what's happening to our cumulative savings here. When we get the first $1,000, we invest it, we get $50 in interest. And then that takes our balance up to, by year 2, when we get the additional $1,000 plus that interest, $2,050. And so that means more interest, and the interest is building. This is compounding interest. We're adding $1,000 each year. which ultimately gets our savings up to $12,578. And this is really interesting. Our if we compare, okay, by year 10 under the investment scenario, and we have $12,578. If we had invested it in the bank at 5%, our discount rate, we would have had $8,144 different dollars. Guess what the difference between those two is? Yeah, it's $4,433, which is exactly what we calculated for the bank account balance we would have at the end of year 10 if we had borrowed the money. And as we said, that comes to a net present value of $2,722. So this is another way of comparing the alternative of investing your money at a 5% bank account interest rate, for instance, versus actually investing in the $5,000 and seeing what would happen at the end of year 10. And then that difference, right, but compared to the alternative, that's really the net benefit of this investment. And if it's anything greater than zero, assuming these are the same risk level, then you would say there's maybe benefit of going with the investment instead. As I mentioned, in this investment scenario, the benefit stops at year 10. It's highly unlikely that it would just stop all of a sudden. Maybe it would start to level off over time. You can do that analysis and make that estimate. It's going to depend on the investment you're looking at, of how the benefit changes and how the cost changes potentially over time. Again, this could be an underestimate for the ROI if we did expect that $1,000 to continue after year 10. And another way to handle that would be to bake in and estimate an amount of depreciation and basically bake in another cash flow at the end. So essentially, if we said, yeah, we're going to be able to sell this for this $5,000 piece of equipment that we purchased, for instance, we're going to be able to sell that for $4,000. That'd be a positive $4,000 at year 10. And so we would divide that by the 1.05 if we're using a 5% discount rate to the 10th power, because we're 10 years out. Put that in parentheses. And so from a net present value perspective, that's 2,456. And so we could say, well, actually our net present value, when we factor in with the fact that we could sell this thing at the end of year 10, it would be all those cash flow, the net present value of all those cash flows we've been getting, minus the $5,000 cost, but plus what we'd be able to sell that $5,000 piece of machinery for, well, discounted to net present value. And so really our net present value might be more like $5,177. And if we're thinking about it this way, technically your raw ROI without considering net present value would be the $5,000 plus the $4,000, since we're in that scenario not discounting anything, $9,000. So now if you don't consider the time value of money, your net payoff would be $9,000 and your net present value would be $5,177 benefit. Now everything we've done so far has been on an annual basis. What if you wanted to calculate this based on a monthly compounding or some other basis? It shouldn't make a huge difference, but I'll show you how to calculate that if you wanted to calculate it on a different period. As we said before, the net present value calculation has to do with periods. In this case, we were using annual periods. If we were to do this monthly, for instance, we would take our annual interest rate, and on a monthly basis, you can think about the interest rate being that divided by 12 months in a year. So our interest rate would be something like this from a monthly perspective. Essentially 0.4% is what this would end up being if we turn this into a percentage here. We'll do that. 0.42% interest on a monthly basis. Well, now that we're doing it based on months, our number of periods has increased because a period is a month instead of a period being a year. So our interest rate has decreased, but our number of periods has increased. And let's just see what happens. So again, we'll do this 1 plus our interest rate, and now we're going to raise that number to not just 10, but 10 times 12, because that's how many months there are, 120 months in 10 years. So that's what we're going to raise it to. Our interest rate is on a monthly level, And so our periods are going to be on a monthly level. And that brings up a kind of total discount factor of 1.647. And I'll take this $1,000 and I'll divide by that. And that brings the discounted cash flow, the net present value of our $1,000 to 607 instead of the 614 we would get if we had only compounded annually. So it actually discounts it a little bit more. Another way of thinking about this is if your interest is compounding monthly and you've invested at the beginning of a time period, it's going to be worth a little bit more 10 years from now than if it were just compounded annually. So that's how it works if you want to do this on any other time period. Just divide that interest rate, get it on whatever period basis. If this was quarterly compounded, you could divide this by 4, and then we'd be, if we were 10 years out, doing it to the 40th power, because there would be 40 quarters over that time period. You get the idea. Well, I hope you got a lot out of today's video. Hopefully at this point, you're able to understand the time value of money, how the discount rate works, and how both of those things impact net present value to really calculate an ROI in a truly robust way. If you like this video, I hope you'll like it formally. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing to our Value Driven Analytics channel, where we publish all kinds of analytics trainings. And if you have any questions on today's topic, please leave a comment and I'll do my best to answer it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.